get drafted. It's Mr. 100. Mr. 100. I hope you become Mr. 10.
I hope for it.
The one time I was on the 100, I didn't get close to Mr. 10.
Yeah.
Good morning to those of you who are joining us by live stream. We're just going to be getting underway in just a moment or two.
David, I'm Luke, by the way. I'm substituting for Marcia.
Oh, okay. So I am the only late.
Sit down, we get started. I hate being late. Where are we sitting?
You can sit right there.
Dave, do you want coffee?
No, I want it fine.
And
Oh.
give Karen a minute.
Well, I must not be the only one late. You said 35.
Yeah, I think there's some traffic issue.
There was, crossing the bridge.
Oh, yeah.
Wherever you want.
Yeah, right.
Is there what's here?
Let's try to see if there's a meeting. Is there an order of,
I don't know how it's going to go.
okay, all right. I think I have it.
You
I have it.
Okay.
All right, I have it.
All right, and the printer didn't get 35, but here's some.
Brilliant, thank
That
you.
didn't get 35. They're available on our webpage.
Okay, super.
And here are the slides I prepared with Charlie.
He gave me a copy of those.
Okay.
And I assume the slide is purpose.
It should be the only one on the stick that says slides on it.
Okay, so there's one GWCS. No, that must be it. Yep.
It's just in case it comes up.
Yeah.
However you want to proceed.
So do you want me to have it
Ready to
up?
put up if you ask the question.
Okay.
Here, let me button the top button so I don't look at it. Was I supposed to say something else?
We should go through that whole process.
That's
Hold
zero
down my cuffs.
photogenic.
Are you very?
I'm not at all photogenic.
Neither
Not in
am
any
I.
picture that you're in.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I look pretty damn ugly.
Same
so
way.
I got hit with an ugly stick early on. It was a real problem in college when I was trying to get a date.
Yeah.
A lot of traffic coming across the bridge.
Just a bridge. Right?
Yeah, it's,
I went to the office and tried to download all the graphic and put it on a slide.
oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Couldn't get it done. And then I tried to print out the extra. And the printer didn't.
Oh, it's a PC.
How do you undo your blank screen?
They don't have these wires.
No, I didn't propose that we read them since we're
Okay.
adjusting them.
Good morning, good morning. Welcome to the George Washington University Law School. We're so glad to have you here this morning for our presentation of the Section 809 panel recommendations. Their report number 3 came out on just 2 days ago on Tuesday, and we're delighted to share with you some of the perspectives of the commissioners on the panel, as well as perspectives from members of the bar, and we certainly welcome your questions and observations from the audience. I am delighted to be joined this morning by my colleague Steve Schooner, and we have really enjoyed very much being part of the panel's experience in opening up their work to the public. We hosted a meeting here of the panel, had an open meeting here earlier during the process of their work. We're extremely proud that we had 4 students who served as, on the staff, 2 JD students, an LLM student, and even a student in our Master of Studies in Government Contracts program. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for student learning, and we've been particularly impressed with the way that the commission, or excuse me, the panel has made their work very open and accessible to the public. So we're really pleased to be able to have this opportunity to continue that and to hear what this audience has to say and to join the conversation. I'm very honored to have the panel that you see before you here on campus, and I'm going to take just a moment to introduce them, and then I will turn over the floor to them. To my immediate left here, of course, we have David Drabkin. He was the chair of the panel and has had a really big week. In addition to rolling out the report this week, Mr. Drabkin was named to the Washington 100 Most Influential People in the Acquisition Field. We're extremely proud of that.
Well, I'd like to be number 10, so would you go vote for me?
Mr. Drabkin, in addition to his extensive and illustrious federal government career as Director of the Acquisition Policy and Senior Procurement Executive for the Office of the Chief Acquisition Officer, has worked at Northrop Grumman and had several very senior positions within the Department of Defense. And most dear to us, he's a frequent visitor in our classes here at GW. Professor Eukins had Mr. Drabkin in his procurement reform course during the fall semester on a nearly weekly basis. You've entirely charmed the students. They speak so highly of you, and you've inspired much of their scholarship, which is to our great delight. So thank you very much for being such a friend to the school. To Mr. Drabkin's left is Mr. Charlie Williams, who is currently, who has been a member of, as a commissioner on the panel, and is currently president of the C. Williams LLC. He also serves as president of the National Contract Management Association and on the Defense Acquisition University Board of Visitors. In his federal service life, he was director of the DCMA, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Contracting for the Air Force, and I just want to take a moment to appreciate the public service and also continuing service that both of you have offered in to this field. It's a great inspiration to the students and a great benefit to our field. So thank you very much. The NCMA partnership that we have GW is something that we treasure very much. And finally, to the far left is Luc Levasseur, who is a partner at Mayer Brown. He's been doing complex federal litigation for more than 20 years and worked in the Department of Justice between 1997 and 2006, where he was lead counsel on Windstar-related litigation and was awarded the John Marshall Award for Outstanding Legal Achievements and a Special Commendation Award for his exceptional contributions in that litigation. So thank you all very much for being here and for your service and for all that you are doing to share your work with our community. And with that, the mic is yours and it is live. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll start. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your interest in the work of the panel. To bring you up to date, well, first, Steve, do these 3 volumes potentially qualify as my thesis?
If you can get your name on the cover, we can negotiate.
It's a running joke for like 10 years. They've been very good to me. Okay, so the panel was created by Congress in the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act. The Secretary of Defense, pursuant to the direction of Congress, appointed 18 commissioners. 2 of those commissioners have since resigned for various reasons. Claire Grady got promoted kinda and went over to DHS, where she's now the acting deputy secretary. And Dee Lee, after 2 years of fighting through all this, said, you know, I just built a brand new home with a heated saltwater pool, swim-up bar, and a jacuzzi, and I haven't been in it yet, so she said enough's enough and went to enjoy her home. The remaining 16 commissioners were divided into 10+1 teams, and those teams were based upon interests that the commissioners themselves identified as we started our review of how to answer the challenge Congress gave us. The teams themselves, I said there was a +1. The +1 will be of actually potentially greater interest to the legal community than the other 10, because what that +1 is looking at is reorganizing the statutes pertaining to acquisition in Title 10, putting them in a single place, taking out of the notes provisions in Title 10, those things which are still relevant to acquisition, and putting them where you can see them. And some of you even may wonder what a note is. But when Congress passes the NDAA every year, it has many different provisions. In fact, one of the chief complaints is over the last 3 years, there have been almost 100 sections or provisions in Title VIII of the National Defense Authorization Act. Not all of them are direct modification to a statute. And so when the people who put stuff in the U.S. Code try to figure out where to stash the various provisions which aren't an actual modification to the statute, they stick them in this thing called notes. And I'm sure in Steve's classes here in the school, he reminds students that the provisions in the notes are every bit as much a law as the provisions that have a little number or a parentheses or whatever. But you can't find them. In fact, in my early career, I was looking at the Berry Amendment and trying to figure out where it was. And for the longest time, the Berry Amendment was an annual provision in the Appropriations Act, and it was stuck in a note. And the only way I found it, it was another lawyer took pity on me and told me where it was. So anyway, the +1 team is looking at that. You don't see much about it except we refer to it here in one of the sections, but it will make a huge difference when it's done. In fact, it'll be the first time since 1947 that all of the acquisition provisions pertaining to the Department of Defense are found in one place. On to the report. Some of you may be able to get a copy. I didn't have the printer. One of the reasons I'm late, I thought I could get it all printed in time, and the printer, of course, when you need it to work, doesn't work. We have prepared an executive summary for you. And it's truly an executive summary. But even though it's supposed to be short, it takes 8 pages. You can find it online and print it out. You'll note that in Volume 3 we have 13 sections. Those sections pertain to recommendations that we've grouped together. And this is a little different approach in Volume 3 than we took in Volumes 1 and 2. And so I encourage you to, when you leave here, because I'm assuming none of you have read the 538 pages in our report, plus the almost additional 500, what we call gray pages, which actually includes the implementing language. One of the differences you'll find in our report and other commissions' report is not only do we talk about a problem, not only do we expose all of the sides of that problem, not only do we make recommendations to fix the problem, then we actually give you the tool if you adopt our recommendation to implement it. That explains why our report, the third volume, is a little over 1,000 pages, 2 reams of paper each. And making it worse, since we have something called gray pages and we have white pages, you have to switch the paper as you're printing it out. Okay. There are other things that I would introduce, and then Charlie's going to talk to you about a couple of specific things. We decided at the very beginning, as a group, we were going to go bold. We were not going to be limited by what the art of the possible was, what we thought was politically possible. We were going to look at the problems that affected acquisition, and we were going to make recommendations to fix those problems, even if Congress may never accept the recommendations we make, or the department may never accept them. Second thing is, we wanted to make sure that as we were looking at all of these issues, that we tried to make changes that moved the department so that it was doing business more like how buyers and sellers do business in the private sector. Guiding all of this, the purpose of all of this was to deliver lethality to the warfighter inside the turn of our near-peer competitors and non-state actors. One of the things we found in our interviews across the country was that the Chinese, in a number of occasions, had been to talk to the same companies we were talking to. And we were talking to companies that weren't doing business with the government. And they were trying to buy the company, its production, invest in its intellectual property, anything so that it could obtain those items. And we know from other stories that when they can't buy it, they steal it. And our goal was to make sure that we provided innovation to our warfighters before the people who might use that same innovation against us. So that's the general approach we took. In volume 3, well, we reserved the stuff that we thought was revolutionary, that was really bold, for volume 3. Well, because our reports were spread out over a year, we didn't want to build resistance to the report at the beginning. We figure we'll get plenty of resistance at the end. And so we left for volume 3 the stuff that we thought would really make a difference and would cause the community to have a discussion about how we achieve the goal which we all agree with, that is to give the warfighters lethality in advance of the people who would use it against us. And so in volume 3, you'll see what I think are the 4 major bold ideas. One, what Charlie will talk to you about, readily available, changing the whole way we think about anything you can buy when you walk outside this law school if you have cash, check, or a credit card. 2, we looked at how do we change the way we manage programs so that we're managing them more like it is done in the private sector, but more importantly so that it groups capabilities together and we can manage things as a group of capabilities instead of as individual single programs. 3, we wanted to make sure we changed the budgeting part, the fiscal law part of the acquisition system so that funds are available and have greater flexibility without taking Congress's ability to provide oversight, but allowing us to shift as the threat shifts. You all know every morning you wake up, you hear about something new going on somewhere in the economy, somewhere in the marketplace, and we need the flexibility to buy tomorrow's solutions today instead of buying yesterday's solutions for delivery tomorrow. And then 4th, we made major recommendation changes for the acquisition workforce. DIWEA was passed in 1990. The department finally got around to implementing it in 1994. And back when it was passed, it made significant and positive improvements to the workforce. But things have changed since 1990. Our needs have changed. In 1990, many people thought that a program manager or a contracting officer, once trained in the schoolhouse, could do anything. We know today that we need people who have capabilities tailored to the marketplace they work in. And those marketplaces do business very differently from one to the next. And then the 5th was Title X reorganization. That's kind of introduction. I don't want to talk all morning because I could. Charlie, why don't you tell them a little bit about readily available, and you can talk also about the acquisition workforce stuff that you...
Can I do that?
I don't know.
Anything else?
Well, throw in
Gotcha.
anything you want, buddy.
Well, good morning. I'm really glad to be here with you all. I sort of like to always know who I'm talking to. Is anybody in here that doesn't have a law degree or hasn't ever been to law school? Oh, good. I feel better now. All right. Just want to make sure. Hey, let me also say it has been a phenomenal opportunity to work with Dave and all the folks that have been a part of this effort. There are some tremendous minds that came around the table and talked through the details of this. We had a phenomenal staff that was available to do the research and help us think through these things. You know, the one thing I remember very early on in the effort was someone came and said, how do you expect all those folks with all that gray hair to make changes or recognize what needs to be changed? And we said, yeah, maybe that's a good point. So we surrounded ourselves with a lot of folks who are just learning and are experiencing this environment for the first time. We reached out to a lot of folks in the field who are doing this business, and all those efforts and all that input became valuable in the final decisions that we made. So good, Dave. Thank you for your leadership. It has been, I think, very valuable to us getting to the bottom line. So let me talk about, you don't think so? Is that why you're
Let me tell you how they treated me with reverence. They refer to me as the dear leader.
So let me talk a little bit about what's in Section 1 of Volume 3, and that's the dynamic marketplace. And tell you a little bit about how we got to where we are. And then we can, in questions and answers, maybe talk more details as you desire. So Section 1 is about the dynamic marketplace, and there's one recommendation. And that recommendation really is fairly simple on its face. And it says replace the current commercial procedures and regulations and the simplified acquisition procedures with this thing we call readily available procedures. Pretty simple sounding, but when you get into the details, it gets to be fairly complex. And what you'll find in the work that we've done is a statutory set of statutory provisions that we've worked on that would enable the Congress to implement this, as well as a DFARS section that would enable the department to implement it in the regulation. So we kept our commitment to not only say, here's what we think you ought to do, but do the hard work of trying to give them the rules and procedures that are necessary to allow them to implement it, recognizing that I think as you move forward and as they bring it into the building, if the Congress authorizes it, there will be other things that they'll need to do to shape this to meet the needs of the department. But as we went to do that, we recognized that as you think about the workplace, the marketplace that we experience today, you have to think about it from the standpoint of our ability to reach that marketplace. So we did a lot of work to go out and talk to, as I said, a lot of traditional companies, a lot of non-traditional companies, a lot of small businesses. And as we went through that process, we heard some of the things that you have known for a long time. There are a lot of barriers to entry. There are a lot of barriers and cost drivers in our acquisition rules and procedures that just put burdens on the system, create friction in the system. Things like IP and who owns IP and the rights to IP and all those kinds of things. You know, there's been a Section 813 panel that has addressed that recently. Things like oversight, audit, and compliance and insight that the government should or should not have into your business, et cetera. Those traditional kinds of things that create barriers. But the one thing that we heard fairly consistently, and really consistently, that I think stuck out amongst all, and I think we had talked about this as a panel, and it's the tyranny of time. The challenge that the procedures, rules, regulations cause the department to have to go through just to transact with the marketplace. The fact that small businesses and non-traditionals can't tolerate the time that it takes to issue a solicitation and then 6 months to a year later know whether or not you're going to win a contract. You can't hold on to the resources necessary that you bid using that in that proposal. All those things are constraints to reaching to non-traditionals. They're cost drivers for traditionals. And this tyranny of time led us to think about, well, how do we think about the marketplace? And when you look inside the current system and you look at how the department does business, while you might think that everything's a lot more simple when you get to the commercial side of the business that we do, the commercial side of the market using FAR Part 12 procedures, it may surprise you that we've seen FAR Part 12 contracts taking years to award. The evaluation process sometimes that they go to gets to be as intrusive as the evaluation process for what we consider as defense unique work. So we thought about this marketplace. What does it look like? And if you see this slide over here, you'll notice that we sort of broke it down into 3 groups. This is not original work, but we modified some original work that we thought was important and spoke to this. And as a matter of fact, we have some references in our report to GAO work who looked at the same type of market dynamic. And so as we broke this down, we broke it into these 3 groups. One is readily available. The second one is readily available with customization. And the third is defense unique. And we think those markets are relevant to how the department does business. Now, I'll just read to you, since you don't have it in front of you, the definitions for each of those, just so you can think about it as we're having our conversation. Readily available is any product or service that requires no customization by the vendor and can be ordered directly by customers to include products and services that only governments buy. Readily available with customization includes the products and services that are sold in the private sector, including to other public sector customers, for which customization or manufacturing that is consistent with existing private sector practices is necessary to meet DoD's needs. And then finally, defense unique development is DoD financed development either to repurpose a readily available product or solution or to develop a new product or solution to provide a defense unique capability. So that's how we thought about the marketplace. Now, when you look at the work that's gone on across volume 1, 2, and 3 of our reports, you'll see that we spent a lot of time dealing with the defense unique market space. In fact, you'll find that the Congress and the department have already done various things to address the department's needs to expedite this set of work, whether it's Section 804 language that allows that people know as mid-tier, whether or not it's OTAs and how we use OTAs inside the department, or whatever the case may be, these areas have been addressed. And in our Volume 3 report, we address it further. And I think in Volume 3, we address it largely from this perspective of portfolio management. And how does the department manage these large defense unique programs? How does money flow, and how is money, how is it flexible across that market space? So I think you'll find in all of our reports a lot of work that addresses the defense unique market space. But in this particular report, we have truly focused on the readily available space, readily available with customization. And oh, by the way, on behalf of my good friend and fellow Commissioner Terry Rainey, please know we're talking not only products, but we're talking about services. Thank you. I didn't want to leave him out. And frankly, when you read our report, you'll see that we believe that by and large, just about every service that the department acquires can be done through a readily available or readily available with customization procedure. So we've thought about all of that. And specifically, as we've looked at readily available and readily available with customization, we just simply said the department needs to be able to transact with the market the way buyers and sellers in the market transact with each other, essentially stripping away all those very burdensome procedures and processes, et cetera, that create time and that's tyranny of time that I spoke about earlier. You'll see that we said essentially in the readily available space, no solicitations. Let's do market-based competition. Buyers should be able to go to the market wherever things are advertised, et cetera, take advantage of that information and make a decision about how they buy. They should be buying using credit cards to the maximum extent possible. So we've created in this rule set that we've promulgated things that will allow that to happen. We said essentially that no small business set-asides in this readily available space, but there's a preference for small business, 5% preference, as we've stated in our report. And there are other things we've said in the protest world that for readily available procedures, protest to the agency and the agency only. And we've set a $15 million threshold on this set of procedures. Now, you know, we've had a lot of discussion about what that threshold should be. We concluded 15 million is probably about right. When you look at that from an action standpoint, that probably gets you to 80%, 80 to 90% of the actions inside of the department, depending on what source of data you look at. But we've also provided authorities for the contracting offices to make a decision on whether or not they can use these procedures for something greater than 50 million. Because when you think about it, what changes necessarily in the risk equation when you go from 15 million to 15 million or to 16 million, right? I mean, if depending on what you're buying, the risk equation may change, but often that risk equation doesn't change just because you're buying more of it. And we believe that these procedures should be used in those circumstances, and we provided that authority. So that's that's our readily available procedures and customization. A lot of detail inside the report that you should read and understand. And there'll be a lot of effort, I think, to really think about how this plays itself out in the implementation procedure. As Dave said, I think this can truly be revolutionary if adopted, and I think it will require some fortitude on the behalf of our legislators and inside the department, because there's a culture that this plays up against. Let me talk quickly about the workforce. We did a lot of work in the acquisition workforce. In Volume 2, we introduced recommendations that address the DAWDA, Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. That's a fund that the Department of Defense utilizes to make changes in its acquisition workforce, either grow the workforce, educate and train the workforce, and offer significant benefits and recruitment benefits to those that they recruit. A real change. That it's a very healthy fund. It's well supported inside of the department and has provided tremendous value. It was something that was actually initiated by the department and Congress, and so we think that needs to be protected. Over the past few years, we saw some erosion to that, and we thought it was important to state the significance of that set of work. In Volume 3, we've now gone further in terms of our perspective about workforce development and training and proficiency. And essentially, we've made 3 recommendations. One recommendation is just, my words, blow up DAWIA. And what that means is blow up the certification processes that the department has implemented as a result of DAWIA. DAWIA didn't say go do this kind of certification. It just says you need to have people certified. And the question becomes, what does that mean? And our simple view is that what happened inside of the department, we created a 3-level certification structure, and certification became a substitute for proficiency and qualification. And in order to reverse that problem, you essentially need to sort of blow up that certification system and sort of start fresh with not that you don't need some type of certification, but in my view, certification is the center of this concentric set of circles where you have certification that's a professional certification that many across industry and the government should adhere to, because that's the profession. But then there's this set of occupational stuff that's specific and unique to an organization, an agency, et cetera. So I think these kinds of perspectives are important. And then how does the department assess competencies and proficiencies? Because at the end of the day, what we want are job-ready people to be able to get the job of the department done. So I'll leave it at that. There's another set of work in Section 6, which is around compliance and so forth. That's near and dear to my heart as well. But we'll hold that for questions as necessary.
If I could, before we transition to our third speaker, just because Steve's sitting here and he's trained me well, I wanted to make sure that you understood that we were bound as we looked at everything we've talked about, and particularly in creating this readily available set of procedures, by the mantra of competition, transparency, and integrity. And as you read readily available, please note that we've introduced a new concept of competition. We've proposed a change to how SECA defines competition, and that what we propose is more like the competition that exists in the private sector. And then transparency, you'll note that we've increased transparency by the requirement to disclose information not currently generally made available during our transactions. So I just wanted to add that because Steve's sitting here and he beat it into my head during.
And you know he probably already has a question prepared.
Probably is going to talk to me about it. I'm trying to, preempt him. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Luke Levasseur. I'm a counsel at Mayor Brown here in town, a couple blocks from here. And I just wanted to thank George Washington University for having me. As you probably saw the pictures of the people who are supposed to be here this morning. You'll notice that I don't look like Marcia Madsen. She's my colleague. I'm sorry you have been, you've been downgraded in your speaker, but I'll try to do my best. Also, before I start, I want to thank the commissioners, Dave and Charlie, and the rest of the 809 panel, or I guess panelists, not commissioners, whatever it is.
Commissioners.
Commissioners, okay, thank you.
I don't support it.
So,
But we've been called other things.
you've
as
been
well.
called other things, well.
Some
I
very
won't-
less pleasant
I-
than panelists.
I won't this morning. But it's a lot of work, and you know, I understand blue ribbon type panels are you know, often huge, thankless tasks, and it's very beneficial to the community that y'all have undertaken this work and done what you've done. That said, I think you did, in fact, go bold, as you said, with respect to some of your proposals. And I am here as part of the resistance, which you also said. And I'm here to talk about the problems that I believe other members of the bid protest bar. I'm a government contracts lawyer, do a lot of different things. One of those things is bid protests. And as I should say, I got the report like everybody else here 2 days ago. So I have not read all 540, however many pages.
33.
533, or the gray pages. The 1,000 pages have not, I've not absorbed all of it, but I'll tell you what I've absorbed so far about bid protests. First and foremost, I think that as I read the report, it would have a dramatic sort of defenestrating effect on bid protests if these recommendations were adopted. And I don't think that this would be beneficial to government procurement overall, and I'll try to explain why. But before I do that, I will say there are a couple of parts of it that I don't really object to and don't necessarily disagree with. Just a couple.
Anything you feel good about?
I'm not going that far. Okay. But there are a couple of things that I don't really disagree with. The recommendation 66, they want to have a purpose statement about bid protests. Okay. I think that most people who work in this space understand why we have bid protests, why the review of sourcing decisions by government agencies are fundamentally different than sourcing decisions made by private industry. The people who make those decisions are checked by their executives, the boards of directors. They're not spending taxpayer money. We don't have bid protests for people who are not spending taxpayer money, but when taxpayers are funding hundreds of billions of dollars of DoD procurement and all the other agencies, we have developed a system because we don't think that it's practical or efficient for congressional committees to oversee specific procurement decisions. I mean, they obviously have the right to do it if they want, but that's not really an effective way to do it. We have a process that has developed where individuals that are affected, interested parties that are affected by procurement decisions are allowed to challenge them and to determine whether the agency, the executive branch official who made the decision, followed the law, applied the statutes and regulations appropriately, and made a reasonable decision. And having a purpose statement that lays that out, if the SECA and all the rest of the procurement statutes don't adequately address that, we want to elaborate a little, no objection. Also, no objection with respect to recommendation 69 about additional enhancements to the debriefing process. This is something that, when you talk to government contractors, they are always, everybody wants better debriefings. They tried in the 2018 NDAA to specify improvements to the debriefing process. Got my issues. A lot of us have issues with those because what they did is they mandated basically a question and answer opportunity at the end of debriefings, and some people feel that we're not getting more high quality information out of the debriefings because of the way that agencies have started doing debriefings in the wake of the 2018 NDAA. I won't get too far into the weeds of it. I'll just say that debriefing reform, as necessary and as good an idea as it is, and as much as I would like you to go bold, it's tricky, and you frequently don't get some of the results that we would like to see. Now, with respect to points of resistance, recommendation 35 is the dynamic marketplace, and this is a huge section, and I'm not going to address all of the changes to FAR Part 12 because, quite frankly, I don't understand them all. It's too big, and I haven't had enough time to fully absorb it. But what I have absorbed is the changes that would be made with respect to bid protest actions of a huge percentage of DoD procurement. And basically, the report indicates there will still be the potential for bid protests. But with respect to, I think you said 80 to 90% of contract actions, I think the report indicates it's more than 55% of DoD spend would be subjected, instead of what we currently have, to a protest system that you wouldn't have solicitations, and you would be limited. I should say you wouldn't have solicitations, wouldn't have mandatory solicitations under $15 million. And over $15 million, you could have solicitations, or the CO could seek an exception to having the solicitation. That's right? Yes. I understand? Okay.
Got it.
Then in that, you could have a protest, but you couldn't protest the GAO or the court. You could only protest to the agency. So more than half of DoD's acquisition dollars spending would no longer be challengeable by an outside independent agency. To the extent GAO, it's not independent agency, it's part of Congress, but it is perceived by the market, being government contractors, protesters, potential protesters, as an independent check on a procurement decision. That would no longer be available. The Court of Federal Claims would no longer be available. You would be limited to an agency protest. Now, yeah, we follow agency protests and agency officials who I believe they look at them in good faith, but there's a reason that contractors that have substantial issues with award decisions and solicitations take those challenges to the GAO and to the Court of Federal Claims, and they don't limit themselves to the agency. The market has spoken. People see where they need to go to get a full analysis of a decision, and basically what these proposals do is take that away. Now, and I'll talk about 67 and 68 as well, which are the sort of streamlining what is left of GAO and Court of Federal Claims protest ability would be streamlined and in parts eliminated, and then it would be also recommendation 68 is to mandate, would be to eliminate protests of anything under any procurement under $75,000, small business procurements. Let's just talk for a second about the protest system and why we have it. We have it because as I said earlier, we can't have congressional committees doing, inspectors general doing analyses of particular procurements long after the fact. And when we're spending taxpayer dollars, we need a reasonable check, a reasonable examination of procurement spending that's being done. And the only way to do it in a timely way that allows agencies to correct problems is to have a real-time bid protest process like the one that we've developed, the GAO Court of Federal Claims protest. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I mean, I've litigated, for a long time in these forums, and they make mistakes. I mean, I've lost cases. There have to be a couple of errors every once in a while. But we have to recognize that these are processes that have developed over a long time, and they are effective at analyzing the appropriateness of decisions. Effective, not perfect. So let's see. And so we've also these sorts of proposals to substantially limit the protest process, we see these every year. This and now the 809 panel has put forward these proposals. But you know, and the panel's report recognizes that GAO publishes its results every year, and it publishes its sustained rate and the rate of cases in which corrective action is taken. They call that the effectiveness rate. And the effectiveness rate year in and year out is 40 to 45%. In other words, and the protests are not we don't sample every single every award and figure out, we're not analyzing, to determine how many errors are made in this entire body of decisions. But of the cases that are challenged, 40 to 45% either result in a sustained protest or a contracting officer making a decision they're not going to defend the award that was made. That's a substantial number of call them defects, call them problems or issues that they don't want to defend. And if you are an executive at a large contractor like Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or Boeing, and you were told that there's a process that tests something that you're doing, and it is finding an error rate of 40 to 45%, and your response to that information was, well, stop doing the testing. Your lifespan at that corporation should be very short. I hope it is. The answer is not get rid of the test. The answer is fix the problem. And I really do, that you're trying to fix some of the problems that we've got in the procurement system. But don't throw the protest process, which analyzes the efficacy of the contracting processes, out before we know that the reforms are fixed. You don't throw them out as part of the reforms, particularly when it's going to be this substantial an effect. I don't believe there, and we've had the RAND study that was published just over a year ago. It's also referenced in the report. Every year there's this discussion of the problems of the bid protest process. Former Chairman Thornberry hired the RAND Corporation to do this big study and largely debunked the assertion that there are all these problems with the bid protest process. Now, that's my interpretation of the RAND study. Anybody else is entitled to their own interpretation. But I think the language of the study is relatively straightforward. There have been a lot of assertions about problems of the protest, and they just weren't borne out when somebody went through and did a detailed, careful, analytical study. Now, I'll try to move it along. With respect to the specific proposals, 35, like I said, we went through the issues with how the protests that would be allowed with respect to this 55% of the spending, 90% of the 80 to 90% of the contract actions, being left with an agency level protest in a situation where there is no solicitation. I'm not saying that it's not a protest remedy. It's a very, very minimal protest remedy that I don't think adequately will address the needs of contractors, and it's not going to provide the sort of fairness, transparency, and oversight of award decisions of a substantial amount of taxpayer money. And I don't understand how that could be adopted when you're talking about basically not a blank check, but an oversight, almost free environment for a huge amount of spending by executive branch officials. With respect to the protest processing time reforms that are set forth in recommendation 67, this would be eliminate the opportunity to file protest at the CFC after a filing and a protest is proceeded at GAO, the second bite phenomenon that is discussed in the report. And also to require the Court of Federal Claims to decide cases within 100 days from the date that that a stay is entered. So it's not from the date of filing like it is at the Court of Federal Claims, as they recommend it. Not they, not just these two, but the Section 809 panel.
Yeah, it took all of us.
It took all of it. So, first of all, I'll leave to Congress whether it wants to sort of dictate docket management to a federal judge and say you have 100 days to decide something. I don't see that happening, but we'll see. But with respect to eliminating the opportunity to file protest at the Court of Federal Claims, you know, we see cases where GAO is a fine institution. I think the world of a lot of those people that I've worked with. As I said, some of them rule against me, and I get really mad at them. But you know, they're good people. They're hardworking, but they're not perfect, and they make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes matter substantially to corporations that have invested a lot of money in B&D. Bid and thank you. Bid and proposal costs, preparing those decisions matter. And it's not a court. You know, it's not. We set this. Not we. The system has developed GAO to have an expeditious and efficient remedy, and by and large, that remedy works. It moves most of the cases, and it finally resolves most of the bid protests that are brought before it in 100 days. When I tell people that I litigate these, what they think of as weird kind of cases, and I tell them that they always start and end in 100 days, they're just blown away. But that's how fast GAO works, and it's very effective and it's very efficient. They do not perfect, but a pretty good job of resolving these matters. In a few cases every year, people are dissatisfied with what happened at the court or at GAO, and they take the case to the court. And because, as the report points out, because GAO is an arm of Congress, can't issue orders, so there's no appeal. You have to take it over, and it's effectively a de novo appeal. And for the non-lawyers, that means you just start over. Albeit in an environment where the judge is sitting there looking at the GAO opinion, and you're not really starting over. I mean, technically you're starting over, but they're not influenced, because I don't want to imply that they're doing anything wrong, but they've seen that this GAO attorney who studied the case came out against the protester or for the protester at GAO, so it affects it. Those cases, you know, there are a small number of cases that are second bite cases. They don't have a gigantic impact on much of anything because the number of cases that go over is way under 1% of procurements. I think it's 0.3% is what's referenced in the RAND study. And again, some of those cases are clearly wrong. Palantir, which was issued last year, the GAO got it wrong. We shouldn't be, a contractor should not be stuck with an erroneous decision because it started in what it perceived correctly as a more expeditious and efficient form. Why is it that you would, the result of this would make a GAO case attorney who was not appointed by the president, not confirmed by the Senate, essentially the last word. And, it could be a multi-billion-dollar procurement, whereas if you go to the Court of Federal Claims, you have a presidential appointed judge, but he's going to be reviewed by three more federally presidentially appointed judges, Senate confirmed, and you have more process, and there's no reason to just restrict the process this way. There's no empirical data that supports the need for it, so I join the resistance on this one. I'm sorry. And the last thing is recommendation 68. I have to admit that I don't do much at all small business procurement, but I will recognize that the RAND study talked about the possibility of adopting a shorter time frame for bid protests in small business procurements. Because, and I was not aware of this, small business procurements are a much bigger percentage of what GAO does than than I knew. I think it's more than 50% of what goes on at GAO. And so you could reasonably say, let's shorten the time frame for some of those protests. Let's make those things a little more efficient because they're not as big a cases and the agency should be able to move on. I can understand that argument, and I think that you can make a reasonable argument. I don't understand saying all of those procurements are just, you can't bring them anymore. You can't set an arbitrary $75,000 limit and say anything below that is unworthy of review. No, COs can make mistakes on smaller transactions as well, and contractors around the country who have made proposals and are trying to do work for the federal government, they deserve some due process as well, and I don't think we should just lop those protests off. So again, I appreciate everything. A lot of hard work. I disagree with the protest reform proposals. So that's all I really wanted to. Those are the points I wanted to make, and we'll throw it open for anything else from Professor Schooner or any questions.
Okay, let's go.
Commissioners an opportunity to.
Do you all want to say anything for Luke, or can we go ahead and start?
Well, if we do, we'll never give you an opportunity to ask your questions.
All right, so again, thank you again so much for coming. I applaud you for your work. To the extent that I have the floor and it's our house, 3 introductory comments and only 1 question. How about that? First, particularly for those of you that haven't read it, let me applaud you for what is a wonderful resource. And let me also specifically thank you for a couple things. First, thank you for posting in a readable, searchable PDF. As we know, often DoD puts things behind privacy walls. This is an easy document to access, and I encourage all of you to not get sucked into the trap of printing it. It works much better electronically, and it's searchable. Let me also say that it's nicely written, and particularly for long documents, that matters. And for those of us that read poorly written long documents, that's not what this is. So thank you for all of that extra work and energy. My students have already heard, and I'll say to you, as I was talking to Charlie earlier, the document is going to be a reference point for basically all research related to the field for probably a decade, if not a generation. Just like many of us consistently go back to the original Packard Commission when we're doing research on numerous topics. And I also, on a related note, you know, I love the idea of bringing the Eisenhower School in, creating the Center of Evidence, but thank you for not suggesting that this fall into the DAU pit of eternal despair. So thank you for that. I hope you succeed. Okay, second thing. Let me
That was the 3.
No, that's just one. And I'm still being positive. Let me offer kudos on the thematic point you made about the DAWIA certification process, right? So checking boxes rather than proficiency should never have been the goal. And the problem is retail rather than output-oriented training. And I think that's really important. But I want to specifically thank you and focus everyone in here on what one of the highest priorities for me in the whole thing is your recommendation 61. Good luck getting it, but I think everyone who's ever studied this agrees that public-private exchanges are potentially the most valuable experiential learning there is. And the joke that we've all been telling for decades is, why would we let anybody write an RFP when they've never written a proposal? There's a fair amount of validity to all that. So good luck with that one as well. I want to make one conceptual point, and I want to take a slightly different approach than Luke did, and I'm glad you put the graphic up here about the dynamic marketplace. Without taking issue with the outcome, I think that what it does is it frames the ultimate issue, and here I think that starting with a policy proclamation strengthened your case, right? Your point is we have to choose between all of these processes and policies that matter to us and getting stuff the warfighter needs. Reminding people that that's the trade-off is the coin of the realm, and I think that it's good the way that you started and framed that. But let's also put it in the context in terms of how that plays out, because it's going to be fascinating to watch. Just last year, we had the biggest expansion in the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold that we've really seen. And for those of us with a little bit of gray hair, it wasn't that long ago, In the 90s, we evolved from impress fund to micro purchases and charge cards. And what we immediately saw was tens of millions of transactions drop out of the radar screen and basically get bundled somewhere else, okay? Now, what we in effect do is we do the ultimate trade-off. We reduce transaction costs, we basically give up transparency, but we get stuff we need quickly, okay? In effect, what you're basically doing is saying, we are willing to make the policy call that for the high volume, low dollar stuff, it's more important to get it than to worry about all the policies that we've been talking about before. So it is a trade-off, and I think that the fact that you stated a policy preference is highly valuable. Okay, quick question then. My question is about something that's not in the report. So, just kind of curious what you're hearing, what you're sensing, what your perspective is in terms of momentum and congressional action. The low-hanging fruit, a lot of that stuff's going to be easy. The question is, what's the stomach for potential change? And for example, other than Thornberry, no longer in the majority at this point, who are your potential champions? Thanks.
Okay, well, what we're hearing, as you may suspect, the bar has focused its attention on protest, probably the smallest part of our report, but from the bar's perspective, very important. We were happy to receive the comments from the ABA on the really crazy ideas that we threw out earlier, and they helped us shape what you see there, whether you like it or not. From companies whom we've talked to, generally speaking, everybody wants us to reduce the friction in the system. That's for companies who do business with us. For companies who are not doing business, what we heard and what we still hear is, tell us how to get to the people who make the decisions about buying stuff. Also, we discovered, and this we brought to the discussion, was our outreach functions. And as you know, we have lots of small business offices whose job it is to go find small businesses. We have the industrial base office, whose job it is to look what's available in industrial base and bring that intelligence to the department. We discovered discovered may be too big a word, it was there for anybody to see, but what's apparent to us is our outreach efforts were to companies who do business with us already, not to discovering those companies who aren't doing business with us and have innovation, which they've already created and we can employ immediately. From companies generally, besides the friction was the issue. It wasn't just clauses. Charlie's led the team that looked at how we improve the audit process, how we bring some predictability. In fact, you'll see in one of our Charlie's recommendations, we promised in Volume 1, now we've delivered in Volume 3, a practice guide for auditors. Big issue for companies already doing business with us. A big issue in terms of the back office function. But more importantly, from operators, we heard, you need to be faster. And it's not just faster on delivering jet airplanes. There's lots of innovation out there. People liked what they saw from Hondo Gertz when he was at SOCOM. He delivered to operators tools that they found or imagined in the matter of days and weeks, sometimes months, as opposed to years and decades. So generally, and now from the Hill, we spoke with the staffers in the HASC and the SAC. We spoke to HACD. I'm sorry for those of you who don't understand the acronyms. We spoke to the House Appropriations Committee on Defense and the Senate Appropriations Committee on Defense. We spoke to small business committees on both sides of the Hill. Nobody made a commitment, but they were all very interested in what we're doing and what aspects they could adopt. I personally briefed Senator Smith, Congressman now Chairman Smith, just before they went into negotiations with the Senate in the summer, and I briefed Senator Reid just before Christmas on all of what we've got. They're interested in various aspects of it. Nobody made a commitment. By the way, it was important when we talked to Senator Reid because he also sits not only as the ranking member on SASC, he's a member in the SAC-D, the Senate Appropriations Committee for Defense. He was very interested and agreed with what we reported and shared with him on the problems that the physical constraints as currently structured pose. No commitment, obviously, one way or the other. It's clear from discussions which have been in the press that they're all interested in continual reformation of the process. One of the things that was interesting that Chairman Smith raised when I spoke to him before conference in the summer was he asked quite openly, frankly, directly, and it was, have we exhausted people with reform? You know, having 3 years in a row, Title VIII, which had used all of the section numbers 1 to 99, essentially 300 different statutory provisions, that's a lot. And many of those, as you know, sitting here, have not been implemented. Which, by the way, for some of the people on the Hill was a surprise. What do you mean? We've passed the law. Why isn't it being applied?
It's because it's in a note that nobody can find.
Some of it, but more importantly, the process, for, as you also know, is for those of you, the majority of you are lawyers, just because Congress passes a law doesn't mean anything changes in the contracting process. Because nothing changes in the contracting process, the result of another law, until it's implemented in the FAR and the DFARs or other agency supplements. And as you probably also know, although most of you don't, read the Federal Register every morning like I do and look at the FAR DFAR's case status at the end of each week, they have got lots and lots of cases ready to go, and none of them are going anywhere. They're sitting there without being able to be implemented. Part of that in this administration is attributed to this administration holds the record for the longest time since it took office before a FAR case was issued, about 10 months. There were lots of good reasons for that, I'm sure, but that explains this backlog. So for all of it, Steve, I can't tell you, I can't prognosticate what's going to get picked up or not. I will observe Kathy Garman, one of our commissioners, who was on the Hill for many, many years in the HASC and in the Small Business Committee. And Kathy offered to us that, you know, your job, they created you to make recommendations, to tell them how they could make things better. And their job is to figure out what they're going to implement. And she said, don't despair. The Section 800 panel, which those of us with gray hair received as a new document in 1993 actually, many portions of Section 800 are still being rediscovered by Congress and implemented. By the way, our recommendation on reorganizing Title X started in the Packard Commission and was reinforced by the Section 800 panel. And now we've actually gotten action on it. As you know, in FY19 NDAA, they created a new part in Title V. It's empty. They now have to populate it, but you know, it's from the Packard Commission to last year is what, 50 plus years? And it's just being implemented. So I guess in the end, there's a lot here, though, that could be adopted by the Department of Defense. For those of you who were present when we rolled this out, one of the senior acquisition executives was there and asked us, tell me how I can get this done now. And we're actually going to provide him with some assistance in those things that he can adopt. By the way, won't affect protest. You can still go up to the Hill and talk to them about protests, but it could be a large number of the things we recommend DoD could implement right away.
See, I just need to take a moment to reflect on your comments about the trade-off, because it truly does, I think, at this time in our nation's history, get down to the trade-off that we're willing to make. You know, when we started this process, we heard from many folks. We heard from warfighters. We've talked in some settings to the Vice Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. We talked to the former Deputy Secretary of Defense and many operators who, although they can't tell us everything they know about the threat, really help us understand the threat. And I think it's hard to appreciate how significant today that threat is.
I just want to give, for those of you that haven't read the report yet, I just want to read you one sentence from the report, because I think it's important, because I'm just looking at the language right now, okay? The report says, DoD's acquisition system must recognize the urgency the country faces and adopt a war footing for its acquisition system that will allow DoD to obtain technological superiority and to sustain the technological superiority it delivers to warfighters. And the media has seized on that language, war footing. But I think that this is the ultimate point. But I applaud you for saying it. Anyway, sorry for interrupting.
The acquisition system is a critical warfighting capability. At the end of the day, it has to be able to provide the capabilities that our warfighters need to be successful. And it would be interesting if we were talking 30 years ago or 20 years ago or even 5 years ago. The fact is the threat is completely different today than it was at that time when many of these regulations were created. You know, the winner of the next war is going to be the person who can bring the best toys to the battlefield. And unfortunately, unlike in the past, those are not industrial-based toys. Today, those are high-tech toys that you and I, in many cases, can go out and buy. And the fact that we don't give our warfighters the capability to go get those things without going through year-long processes is, in my mind, unacceptable. And so I said, there's going to be, to adopt this stuff, it's going to require fortitude by those over on the Hill. And I understand constituencies and all those kinds of things, and they'll make those decisions. But we're at this tipping point, I think, in the nation's history where we're going to have to make some tough choices. And frankly, for me, to have capable people, skilled to do this business, spending their time on stuff that in some cases today can just truly be done by AI, you know, makes no sense. It's not value, it's not using the nation's resources, the taxpayers' dollars wisely. We can put them to better use. And while you can look at it and say, well, you know, we're spending lots of that's true, but at the end of the day, I'm spending lots of taxpayer resources by using critical capability to do non-complex stuff when I need them to do complex stuff. And I think it's important that we understand.
And it our feelings on this matter are reinforced by the interviews we had with companies who told us, some of them, not all of them, that the Chinese had already been there. And the only restriction the Chinese had, besides the laws on export-import, was how much money was in their checkbook. We can't do that. And it was American stuff. Kind of reminds me, you may remember as we introduced FASA in 1994, we had a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force come and talk about radios. Of course, it's a little different system. But we couldn't buy radios from a U.S. manufacturer to deliver to our people. In the end, the Japanese bought those radios and delivered them to our warfighters. We had pilots who at the time bought advanced GPS systems from the company, the store that went out of business, the tech store that everybody played with. Radio Shack had them delivered to their air base in the area of operation and put those things on their laps as they flew missions. Those problems which we identified then have amplified even more greatly. And if we want to, we're at war now. We chose war footing on purpose. We realized that it might have people look at us thinking we were crying wolf. But today the Chinese are at war with us. The Russians are at war with us. The fact that we don't declare war is a political matter. And we have to be able to fight that war, empowering our people with technology. They don't need to be, we need to do it recognizing the issues of public trust, maintaining those things. And we've proposed ways to provide alternative solutions to the current process. But the current process that we have does not reflect the market. We are generations behind what's going on in the market, and the market is where many of these solutions lie.
Yeah, I'd like to cede my time to the audience. Please, go ahead.
And why don't you introduce yourself before you ask your question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Mike Garland. I'm a graduate of the LLM program. I'm a consultant to the government in acquisition matters. I've been working in this for a while. I know David for a few years as well. But my question about the dynamic marketplace, is it intended to supplant the notion of commercial items? Is it supposed to exist with commercial items? How is that supposed to interface?
It consumes that bucket of stuff, right? If you think about readily available as being the big circle, and inside of that are commercial items, non-developmental items, et cetera. So it consumes.
So if it's,
and services.
I didn't read the implementing approach, but if it were to be implemented, does it change all the definitions of commercial items?
Yeah, it starts to do all of that.
Commercial off the shelf.
Goes away.
The whole thing, but that's just in the DFAR side, not on the FAR.
We have, Congress chartered us to make recommendations about the DoD acquisition system. We have tried to limit ourselves to that. There have been some cases where we couldn't. So, for example, in our interim report, we made recommendations about changing the FAR to make it clear that the purpose of the acquisition system was to accomplish the mission. But we have tried to be consistent. Now, also, we've provided, in many places where we've provided legislative solutions, we've provided pointers to Title 41 so that if Congress wanted to extend some of these proposals to the private sector, it would be very easy for them to do.
But I think the other thing I would say is, in my experience, as DoD goes, so does the rest of the government. But also remember, we're talking about a different mission than many other agencies in the government, and I don't want to lose sight of that. This is very, very important for the national security mission that the Department of Defense has. Is there a reason not to do this other agencies so that the Congress can meet other social responsibilities that they have? Maybe, maybe not. That's a choice they have to make. We know this is important for DoD and absolutely critical for DoD.
Good.
I'm Jacqueline Richardson. I'm also a graduate here and took courses in the government procurement program, and I'm with Deloitte now. Building on that last comment, would you be able to name any specific recommendations that the panel made in this latest volume that got some traction or that the other members, the non-DoD members, the GSA and NASA of the FAR Council seemed receptive to, so that we get an idea of what some of those may have the true possibility for changing the acquisition system in its entirety?
We continually reached out to draw in other agencies, members of the FAR Council in our discussions. I have no idea, honestly, and OMB. We briefed OFPP a number of times. They had people come participate in our meetings regularly. I can't honestly tell you what, if any of these things they're interested in or might want to, adopt themselves. I just can't do that. In the coming And to be fair, they didn't see volume, although they were invited to participate in our discussions, they didn't see the final until you did. And so in the coming months, we'll get to see that. We're good. The commissioners are appointed through July 30th, although most of our staff are, as you imagine, starting to look for other places to land, and they should. But we'll be available to answer questions and support civilian agencies if they want to ask them. Yes, ma'am, there's a one over.
I'm behind the pole.
You can't see it.
Hi, I'm Dawn Stern. I'm at JD from GW and at DLA Piper. And you talked a little bit about the idea that there are companies that are saying we don't know how to enter the marketplace and that this readily available could help that. And I'm wondering if you could touch a little bit on the flip side. I think there are a lot of companies that choose not to do business with the government because of all the socioeconomic requirements and others. Or who have pulled out because they just don't want to comply anymore with the increased requirements. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you found as you toured and talked to different companies in that arena, and if you think that this would help that.
Well, it's true. We talked to all of those companies, those who choose not to do business, those who have done business and are no longer doing business, and the traditional companies who are in the space. And it's a matter of cost and their ability to sustain their company under the tyranny of these procedures and processes. Many of them, who have gotten investments from venture capitalists. Venture capitalists tell them, don't do business with the Department of Defense. It's not something we're willing to invest in. So we believe, as you get to this set of readily available procedures and processes, which are really truly intended to allow the department to do transactions and transact with that marketplace the way it transacts with other commercial buyers in that market space, gives them the benefit of being able to know that they can operate with the DoD without all that stuff and all that friction that comes with the current set of procedures. So I truly, the commission wouldn't have put it forward if we didn't believe there are opportunities. And when you ask the companies that are out there about these things, these are the kinds of things they would absolutely tell you we need to be doing.
I'd share with you that initially we were associations of existing companies doing business with us, existing companies who are doing business with us, came to us and cautioned us not to forget them. They were worried, as you may know, a year and a half or two ago, when Congress provided a statutory definition of non-traditional, that somehow they would be treated as second class or thrown away. We understand that the changes we're making, proposing in readily available, will reduce the overhead, part of our objective, for new companies who want to do business with us, or companies who left the market space and might be interested in coming back, overhead that companies who do business with us every day have to live with and figure out how to deal with, because they've already built it into their process. We understand that this may pose some challenges in that arena, but we think, since our goal and objective is to deliver innovation, lethality to the warfighter, that we have to balance those issues with, we need to get the best stuff there is in the world, because the people who are challenging us in the world are getting the best stuff. You know, we mentioned, I think, briefly in at least one space, the issue of China 2025. Many of you may not be familiar with it, but China has set a goal to be the lead competitor in the market space for the world in 2025, and they are devoting time, attention, and resources to doing it. We don't have a similar objective. Hopefully this will drive towards it.
And they're not encumbered by the FAR or DFAR.
Although, as an anecdote, when I was at GSA, every year, at least twice a year, delegations from China were brought to us to talk about our acquisition system. And in the end, they all were shaking their heads. They even invited me twice to China to talk to them about our acquisition system. I think the whole idea was how to design a system not like ours.
But let me, that's a point that I think we ought to discuss too, because we've talked a lot about how do you make the FAR sing, right? When you talk to people, particularly on the defense unique side, everyone pretty much says, I can do what I need to do within the current set of regulations. I can get it done, particularly on the defense unique side. The question is about leadership. It's about risk-taking. It's about culture, et cetera. And it's about knowledge and abilities to make the FAR sing. In fact, we had a lot of discussion around this idea of how you make the FAR sing. So the system of regulations in and of itself isn't necessarily the problem on the defense unique side. And I think people have to understand that as we move forward. However, all of those procedures and processes, when you move them down into the area of readily available, commercial, et cetera, are just get in the way. They really get in the way.
Yeah, I think we have time for one question. I see, Craig, you've had your hand up.
Good morning. My name is Craig Barrett. I am currently a government agency attorney at the Government Publishing Office. And so as a former JAG with the Marine Corps, I definitely understand how the buzzword support the warfighter has everyone jump through a bunch of hoops and actually do the things that are necessary to give the warfighter what they need because they're considered to be the tip of the spear. However, what my concern is, particularly with just having an agency level protest, is the impact that it might have on and the chilling effect of the best practices of the agency because they anticipate there might be some oversight, there may be some third-party review. It reminds me of the old Dilbert article or comic where the manager comes down to the employee and says, why aren't you working? And the employee says, because I didn't see you coming. And so with the agency, if we see oversight coming, what happens is that we engage in the type of practices that can be called best practices. And if that's one of those unintended consequences where the agency is not engaging in best practices, can we in fact say that we are engaging in a type of trade-off if we're not knowing what we're giving up to begin with? One last point, particularly with my agency, I often say to the contracting officer, I say to the business units, the directors, SES alike, I say, let's pad the record as if there's going to be a third-party review. And that has been the basis of defining whether the record is actually created well enough, at least for my satisfaction, or a legal sufficiency review. My concern is if we give the keys to the inmates of the asylum, the best practices would just go right out the window, and we suffer as a result.
Well, again, this is why we say you've got to read everything we've written and put it all together. There's a trade-off. Part of that trade-off is the exposure to light, to the air. We require in here for readily available as part of the trade-off the publication of parts of the contract file which you never see currently, which will give you immediately an opportunity to see whether or not they followed the rules, and if they didn't, give the agency to see whether or not they follow the rules. Now, I can't speak for the civilian agencies, but we spoke to all the senior procurement executives in the department and all of their general counsels. Every one of them wanted a protest process to exist. Every one of them thought that a protest process provided value in the sense that it at least told people that their work was going to be reviewed. But every one of them said the current process is crazy and doesn't focus on achieving the mission. Set that aside for a second. Only 1% of our transactions ever get, actually it's less than 1%, get protested. Less than, now an effectiveness rate, I'm sorry, Dan created this and it was great. The effectiveness rate is not the measure. Ask somebody who has won a protest, did you ultimately get the contract? The answer is almost always no. The effectiveness rate ought to be, did you win? That's about 25% of the time. We think that's important. We think the threat of a protest process is important. We've moved it out of the contracting office to the competition advocate, so it's not the guy doing his own work, reviewing his own work. We've only addressed the changes to those things which involve relatively low risk, relatively minor, shouldn't be complicated. The stuff that's important, the stuff that really drives competition among the small group of companies left in what used to be called the defense industrial base, that's not changing, other than the 75,000. Someone asked, why'd you pick 75,000? Well, you know, Chris Eukins and Steve Schooner go around the world trying to convince people what to put in trade agreements. Well, our trade agreements pick, I think the lowest was 65,000, below which no review is required. We picked 75,000 based upon a number of different numbers, and it's consistent with what we tell everybody else in the world to do. Again, I know protests are going to be the area where there's going to be the most amount of discussion, and probably articles. It's the least important part of our proposals. It is something we felt, I mean, all of us, Charlie talked and experienced it. I experienced it when I was in DOD and at GSA. People were afraid of protests. And people did stupid things, which didn't, by the way, keep them from getting protested, to prevent a protest. Just expose the file. By the way, I know you're going to run us off the stage. I know my colleague here wants to say something before we leave. Everybody, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sam Kidd. Sam has been on our team since the beginning. Sam is one of the primary drafters of our readily available material. He also helped us in many other areas. He will soon also become our executive director because Chris Veith is retiring. And now I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir. I know you want to say something.
No, just the parts of the record that would be exposed, as I understand it, are a redacted source selection decision document and a redacted technical review. To your point, sir, I don't believe, I mean, obviously that's better than nothing, but it's not the basis to have a full examination of a record. It's not going to give a lot of potential protesters who, you know, could discover violations of the law that mattered with respect to procurement decisions, a full and fair opportunity to really protest or to litigate those cases. And I'm glad that it's better that the protest would be moved out of the direct office. That's not a bad reform for an agency protest, but a lot of people think that there needs to be an additional, myself included, needs to be additional protest reviews and opportunities to have a real transparency and a real opportunity to examine the procurement decisions. So I'll stop.
Last word, Mr.
Charlie?
Oh, last word?
It's all of
Is
you.
it just one word?
As many as you want.
No, I'll just take you back to where we started in our for the premise of our decisions. This is a critical national defense imperative that we get this right for our warfighter and for our nation. And no more critical time than today. You don't know what I know, and I don't know what others know to that level of classification. But I can tell you what I know makes me think, and what makes me know that we better do something. It may not be exactly all of this. The Congress is going to make some choices. But at the end of the day, they need to make decisions that deliver warfighting capability in excess of what our competitors have. And the current system isn't doing it. Absolutely not doing it.
I can't help myself.
I knew you would have the last word. Come on.
You know, when we talk about warfighting capability, keep in mind that it's not just electronics. It's the way we deliver medical care in the field. Right. It's the uniforms we provide them, which they are so advanced and in the future are going to be even more advanced. It's every aspect of what we deliver that helps bring our warfighters home safe. That's my You have the last word, though. Say something else.
Thank you, dear leader.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Just day of the panel's big rollout. So we hope the discussion will continue. Thank you very much again for helping us get it started. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mine is the first name on the report.
There you go. Well, and this audience.
Put your name on the
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and
So for example, I love the law because on Kendall's office. And some of the things
He emailed me yesterday.
How are you?
Being in there? Yeah. Working. So I was,
Yeah, I know. We were trying to do that. Yes. No.
when you're ready, I'll meet you here. We'll talk. Please.
yeah.
Okay. Safe trip.
Yeah.